All right, this is going to be the video for the 6.02 lesson, Debate and Division. And let's read the introduction before we go on to the lesson. The 1850s brought some compromise, but the conflict over slavery and other issues led to the upheaval around the nation and terrible violence in Bleeding, Kansas. The Supreme Court added to the turmoil with the Dred Scott decision, declaring that slaves were property and had no rights of citizenship. In the midst of the impending crisis, Abraham Lincoln emerged on the national scene in a series of artful campaign debates against Stephen Douglas. He lost that Senate election, but 2 years later, Lincoln won the presidential nomination of the young Republican Party. His victory in 1860 led South Carolina to secede, which means break away. That's an important vocabulary word to know there. War loomed. Goals for this lesson: describe the rise of the Republican Party in the 1850s, recognize the impact of the Dred Scott decision, and describe the significance of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Before we go on, though, remember, let's quickly review the last lesson. Some of the important information to remember from the 6.01 lesson, Growing Apart, was the Compromise of 1850, how they were going to bring in the new territories won from the Mexican-American War, whether they be slave or free, and also the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which would be bringing in the Kansas and Nebraska territories with the idea of popular sovereignty, the idea that they could vote, those states could vote for themselves whether they would be free or slave states, and then all the ensuing violence that gave Kansas the name Bleeding Kansas. And then also be able to remember Harriet Beecher Stowe and the impact of her book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Another person that was introduced in the first lesson here, lesson 1, was John Brown, and we'll be reading about him again today in the 6.02 lesson. Before we move on, don't forget to go to lesson resources and get your reading guide and the lesson answer key ready so you can be looking through those as we go through this lesson today. So we're going to start with pages 402 through 406. Okay, starting with on page 402, starting with the birth of the Republican Party. As a result of the turmoil surrounding the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Jacksonian party system collapsed. The Whig Party ceased to exist, and the Democratic Party lost most of its support in the North. In the North, anti-slavery forces in each party joined to form new coalitions. At first, these coalitions went by a variety of names, but by 1854, former Northern Whigs, Democrats, and Free Soilers began to refer themselves as the Republican Party. In the South, most former Whigs went over to the Democrats as the strongest supporters of slavery. What many of the Founding Fathers had feared now seemed to be happening. America was divided along sectional lines, with Republicans in the North and Democrats in the South. Because the North had more citizens than the South, after the 1858 election, the new Republican Party controlled the House of Representatives. The only political organization to thrive in both sections of the country was the anti-immigrant American Party, also known as the Know-Nothings. Playing on the fear of the new Irish and German arrivals, the Know-Nothings won dozens of congressional seats in the 1854 elections. When the Kansas crisis focused attention on slavery, immigration became a less immediate concern to many voters. By 1856, most Know-Nothings in the South returned to the Democratic Party, while most Know-Nothings in the North became Republicans. Just weeks after the assault on Charles Sumner, Republicans met in Philadelphia for their first national convention. And remember, Charles Sumner was the man who was beaten on the floor of Congress for being against slavery. He was beaten and wasn't able to return into Congress for 4 more years. Okay, going back. Here we are. They called for a ban on slavery in the Western Territories and nominated John C. Fremont, the explorer of California, maybe you remember reading him in Unit 5, as their first presidential nominee. Although Fremont lost the election to the Democrat James Buchanan, Republicans gained many seats in Congress. The Dred Scott case, and there's a picture of Dred Scott, an artist representation. In March 1857, just 2 days after James Buchanan was sworn in as president, the United States Supreme Court fueled the already blazing fires of sectional conflict with its landmark decision in the case Dred Scott versus Sanford. Born a slave in Virginia, in about 1800, Dred Scott was sold to an army doctor in Missouri, a slave state. In the 1830s, the doctor moved to Illinois, a free state, and then to the Wisconsin Territory, which lay north of the 36th North parallel and was thus a free territory according to the Missouri Compromise. And here's an interesting fact. I just learned this last year, that actually Dred Scott and his the doctor, they lived at Fort Snelling in Minnesota for a while. So Dred Scott was actually at Fort Snelling. The doctor moved his household back to Missouri, where he died in 1843. With the help of white abolitionists, Dred Scott sued for his freedom on the principle of once free, forever free. That is, Scott argued that he had ceased to be a slave once he had been taken to live on free soil. A Missouri court ruled against Scott, but the case climbed its way up to the judicial ladder to the Supreme Court. The case drew national attention. Those for and against slavery eagerly awaited the court's decision, since they knew that beyond deciding Scott's fate, the decision would have larger implications for slavery in the United States. Chief Justice Roger Taney was a former slave owner from Maryland, appointed in his lifetime post by Andrew Jackson. Remember, Chief Justice or Justices of the Supreme Court serve for life or until they resign, either die or resign. Writing for the majority, Taney ruled that first, that slaves were not citizens of the United States, and therefore Dred Scott had no right to bring a case before the federal courts. African Americans, Taney bluntly stated, had no rights which any white man was bound to respect. And that is a powerful decision. Taney could have stopped at dismissing Scott's petition, but he went further and into much more controversial ground. In effect, he overturned the Missouri Compromise of 1820 as unconstitutional. The act had forbidden slavery north of latitude, but said Taney, Congress had no right to restrict slavery in the territories or anywhere else because such restriction violated the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, which guarantees that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. By this reasoning, since slaves were considered property, it was unconstitutional to deprive white American citizens of their property. The Supreme Court's decision overturned not only the Missouri Compromise, but also the principle of popular sovereignty in the territories. Western settlers could not vote to prohibit slavery because by Taney's reasoning, that would amount to depriving citizens of their property without due process of law. In the end, the court's decision opened all of the territories to slavery. So Dred Scott's decision was vitally important and very controversial for saying that slaves were not people, they were just simply property, and that you could not, and then the other part of the decision was that you could not deprive people of their property without due process of law, which in essence made any territory in the United States open to slavery. A very powerful decision. Okay, Southern Democrats were overjoyed. They hailed the Dred Scott decision as the funeral sermon of the black republicanism. But the Republican cause was far from dead. Indeed, the court's decision so angered Republicans, they responded with new vigor. They accused President Buchanan and the Taney court of being a pro-slavery conspiracy. They set their sights on the election of 1860, vowing to win the presidency, appoint new Supreme Court judges, and overturn the Dred Scott decision. So the Dred Scott decision is one of the vitally important Supreme Court cases that you will learn about in U.S. history. One of the Marbury versus Madison was one we learned about back in Unit 2 or 3. Dred Scott's one we're learning about now in Unit 5, and there'll be more as we go through the course. The Lincoln-Douglas debates. And that's a picture, an early picture of President Lincoln. In 1858, national attention was focused on the U.S. Senate race in Illinois. Stephen Douglas, the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was running for re-election to the Senate. Many thought Douglas might run for president in 1860. Douglas's challenger was a little-known 49-year-old attorney from Springfield, Abraham Lincoln. A native of Kentucky, Lincoln spent his boyhood in southern Indiana before moving to Illinois. With less than a year of formal schooling, he became a successful lawyer and served several terms in the Illinois state legislature as well as a single term in Congress. An admirer of Henry Clay's American system, young Lincoln had been a lifelong Whig. When his party dissolved, he joined the Republicans. Clothes sat awkwardly on Lincoln's lanky 6-foot 4-inch frame. He was plain-spoken, modest, and easy to underestimate. Those who took him for a country bumpkin were quickly proven wrong. His friends knew that beneath his simple exterior was something more complicated. Lincoln was keenly intelligent, politically shrewd, and quietly ambitious. His law partner, William Herndon, once remarked that Lincoln's ambition was like a little engine that knew no rest. In Stephen Douglas, Lincoln had a worthy opponent. The two men had known each other since the days they served together in the state legislature. At every turn, their fates seemed intertwined. Douglas had even briefly courted the young Mary Todd, whom Lincoln eventually married. But while Douglas's political career was taking off, Lincoln's had stalled. Douglas was one of the most powerful politicians in the country. Lincoln, on the other hand, had not held public office in almost 10 years. Lincoln kicked off his campaign with a speech in Springfield, which he declared that a house divided itself cannot stand. And this is an important quote that's attributed to Lincoln. A house divided itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Running as a moderate Republican, he pledged to stop the spread of slavery into the territories, but not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. In the weeks that followed, Lincoln and Douglas met for a series of 7 debates. Traveling the state, they spoke for hours at a time before crowds that numbered in the thousands. In the thick summer heat, Lincoln dressed in shirt sleeves without a tie or jacket. Herndon remembered that his friend stood square at his feet with both of his legs straight up and down, toe even with toe. His voice, at first sharp, shrill, piping, and squeaky, dropped as he spoke, becoming harmonious, melodious, musical. Lincoln knew how to frame complicated ideas in simple terms. Throughout the debates, he walked a fine line between denouncing slavery and appearing to advocate black equality. Douglas appealed to the crowd's racism and claimed that Lincoln wanted to force racial integration on white Americans. Lincoln carefully argued that while black people had a right to freedom, they were not the social or political equals of white people. He insisted the real issue was not equality for African Americans, a cause that had little support among the voters in the Crown, but slavery. Here Lincoln held his ground, affirming that there could be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another. Douglas was in a difficult position. He had staked his career on popular sovereignty. He promised his constituents that people of Kansas and Nebraska would decide for themselves whether to allow slavery in their midst. Lincoln hammered home a simple point. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision had overturned popular sovereignty, and it was now time for a Republican Congress to find new and definitive ways to stop slavery from spreading into territories. At a key debate in Freeport, Illinois, Douglas attempted to salvage his platform with a complicated argument. He claimed that citizens of Kansas or Nebraska did not want slavery, they could simply refuse to pass laws or enforce policies that protected it. If Southerners brought their slaves into the territories, the police could refuse to catch runaways, the legislature could refuse to pass slave codes, and the courts could make it easy for black men and women to seek their freedom. Douglas's slippery Freeport Doctrine, as it was called, did not win many followers. In the 19th century, that's the 1800s, United States senators were elected by state legislatures. Though the Republicans in Illinois won more popular votes, the Democrats retained a slim majority in the state house and re-elected Stephen Douglas. But Lincoln emerged from his defeat a national celebrity. His debates with Douglas had been reported across the country, and Republicans hailed him as a hero. A moderate anti-slavery man from an important Midwestern state, he was a possible choice for vice president in 1860. Lincoln had other ideas. "The taste is in my mouth," he wrote to a friend in April 1860. He set his eyes on the White House. And we'll stop here with this first video and start with the next one at John Brown at Harper's Ferry, another pivotal point leading up to the American Civil War.